My name is Chris Leonard. I'm one of the Austin Python meetup organizers. Been writing code for about 20 years. Most recently, I've been working with Terminal Labs. We're a high-end Python and DevOps consultancy based here in Austin. And one of my favorite things to do is to play around with APIs. I've always loved APIs. I like to tinker with them, both building them and consuming them. And if you have done any web-based development in Python, you're familiar with Django and Flask. More recently, there's been FastAPI is billed as a more modern web framework for specifically for building APIs. So here's FastAPI. It's a modern, fast, high-performance web framework. They build themselves as being very fast, on par with Node.js and Go. And one of the things that differentiates it is this the way? That it's built on some existing standards and existing libraries. And this, I don't want to go too much into what FastAPI actually is. We actually had a wonderful presentation a couple years ago from a gentleman named Collier King on the basics of FastAPI, and this is his repo from that talk, and a simple little diagram that explains what it is. It's an API micro framework built on top of Starlette, which is a generic web micro framework intended for you to build your own things on top of it. Pydanic is a framework meant for data validation, and it all sits on top of Unicorn, which is an ASGI web server. So I've been interested in FastAPI for quite a while. One of the issues is because it's such a new framework, you're missing a lot of the third-party ecosystem of tools around it that you would come to expect with something like Django or Flask. One of those is an administrative interface. I only recently found out that there's actually several options for an admin interface for FastAPI. The one I'm focusing on is Starlette Admin, and it was built for the Starlette framework, but can therefore be used in FastAPI as Starlette is dependency of FastAPI. So this is their example application. It looks pretty full-featured. It's got a lot of stuff on the home screen. And so what I really wanted to do, I'm kind of a tinkerer, is I wanted to go and play with it, see if I could get it running and what I could do with it. I specifically did not look at the source code for this example because I wanted to see how robust the documentation was and what I could do without cheating and looking at somebody else's work. The approach that I took, I use a Vagrant box. If anybody's not familiar with Vagrant, it allows me to run a virtual machine on my local machine, configured as such. I'm using Ubuntu. This little bit provisions my machine's resources for the virtual machine. I wrote a provisioning script that basically, as the machine is spinning up, it updates the package manager, installs, I'm using Miniconda from Anaconda to create my environment, initializing all of that, installing Postgres. Normally I would do this sort of thing with SQLite or something like that, or stub the data in a JSON file, but because Starlette Admin works with database ORMs, I wanted to use SQL Alchemy, so I went ahead and spun up Postgres. And then just for ease of use, I wrote a Linux service so that this will just run anytime this machine is booted up. Where do we start? Let's start with a model. I built a stupid simple to-do list application with a task model that has a title, the name of the task, and whether or not it's completed. I wrote a seed, a database seed, and all the instructions for this are in the README. I wrote a seed program that fills the database with some example tasks and then randomly assigns them as completed or not completed. I believe I have not emailed Jacob, so that's not complete. Do what? We have a technical issue. Jacob, can you still hear me?
You're good. You're good.
We're having a technical issue here. We need to
You are good.
just plug this into USB-C.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, here. Hold. Might need to move your. Where's the camera? Oh, that's right. We are technically savvy, I promise. Okay, so we looked at the model and how I seed the database. You'll notice I'm for anybody who's familiar with this stuff, I'm not using migrations. I just use the SQL Alchemy base to create this version of this model and then to fill it with data. I created a one-page app instead of separate routing files and anything more complex. I have two methods, a get, which returns all the tasks, and a post, which allows me to post tasks. So failed to establish connection. Well, that didn't work out well. Let's just pretend like it works. It was working a second ago. And of course, I step up here and it doesn't work. But this gets the task, and this allows me to post a task. And so my version of it, let's talk about how it's, you import SQL Alchemy, your database stuff, and then you import the Starlette Admin. It's billed as being able to work with any ORM, though it doesn't really tell how to configure. The documentation doesn't really tell you how to configure other ORMs. But this is how we do it for SQL Alchemy. If you're familiar with app factories in Flask, it's basically the same thing. You create an app and then mount the admin interface to the app. And then Zoom is getting in the way of my tabs. Don't laugh at me. Laughing at Zoom. Where is my version of it? I need to spell correctly. Okay, so here's my bare bones version with an interface for my tasks. I can create a new task. I can edit them. And so this seems to work pretty well. My real curiosity, again, I wasn't trying to copy somebody's existing work or make this correct. It was more of a journey to see if I could get it spun up and what I could do with it. And so, out of the box with my one model, this works pretty well. In the README, I have, let's go to the actual GitHub repo. I have a README that talks about how I install it with Vagrant, and then some caveats. So Starlette Admin does not currently appear to be on Anaconda, so I installed it via pip into the Conda environment. It requires SQL Alchemy with the async IO add-on, and so I removed SQL Alchemy from the requirements that are being used by Conda to spin up the environment, and pip installed it as such. Now, this is interesting because if you go to, where is it? Yeah, so this is the Starlette Admin, the actual repo, and they claim to work with SQL Alchemy, SQL Model, which is an ORM created by the creator of FastAPI that is a light wrapper on top of SQL Admin, and Pydantic. I have not used it. I chose to use SQL Alchemy because it's so familiar. But what's interesting is that even if you're following the instructions to provision this for SQL Alchemy, you have to have SQL Model in your requirements, because somewhere deep in the source code, it actually imports it. So even though I'm using SQL Alchemy and not SQL Model, I have to include this in my requirements. And honestly, if I were doing this for a real world project, I would probably explore this project since it seems to have more direct support, and just take this out for a spin and see if it works as well as SQL Alchemy does, if it's easier. You know, the guy who wrote FastAPI does pretty good work, so I'm actually really curious about that. Any other caveats? Zoom is in my way again. Yeah, so those are the basic caveats that I worked on. I wanted to take this a little bit further and look at how the customizations work, but it was actually a little bit of work just to get it up and running. I have some C also stuff. I would not suggest using my code for like your own project. It's really more of a journey to see like, is the ecosystem for FastAPI catching up to the other frameworks, and can it be used in production? The answer is maybe. You know, if I were working on a startup or a personal project that I intended to take into production, I think I might do a little more work to make sure that this is going to work out of the box. And I think it also depends on whether the admin interface is like a mission critical part of your project. Related projects, Starlette Admin lists Flask-Admin as an inspiration. There is a FastAPI admin and a SQL admin. They work with different ORMs. I just chose Starlette because it was the first one that I heard of. Yeah, so here's a link to Collier King's previous, all of his resources that he created when he presented FastAPI to this meetup in the first place. A link to the demo and the demo source. Is there anything else I need to cover in here? I think that's really it. It was an interesting journey over the last few days to just get this spun up and to get myself familiar with the weaknesses of it, and to kind of get my head wrapped around what you would have to do to take this into production. The documentation is pretty light, so I think going to the source code for the sample app, if you're somebody like me who likes looking at other people's source code and stealing from it creatively, then that's probably the way I would go. I don't know if I would suggest to somebody asking me for advice to like go all in on FastAPI in this particular product just yet, because the ecosystem is still developing. But for those of us who love APIs, FastAPI is really promising. It's fast, it's performant, it takes advantage of some of the more modern additions to Python, like typing. Pydantic is wonderful for validating your data and for handling invalid data elegantly, which you can get into if you dig more into the FastAPI resources themselves. So while my code is not, the best example of something that you would take and build a project off of, I'm very proud of having dug into this, found all the little gotchas and working around them just to get the thing to work. I plan on doing exactly what I said and digging into the source code and seeing if I can build something more like this admin thing, which if you're familiar with the admin interface that comes with Django, it's a heavy hitter, it's highly customizable, it's really powerful. I'm not sure that this is quite that powerful, but if you're just building APIs and not like a full stack monolithic application like Django was made for, it looks like it could be a pretty good option. So that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions?
What would this replace for you in your day-to-day? Is that just Django admin kind of thing, or?
So I tend to use Flask more because I do more service-based stuff, and a lot of my projects that I do, I work for a military nonprofit. I do registration apps. I do all that stuff in Flask. Because Django, if you've used it, it's a wonderful framework, but it's like a bludgeon on the head to learn the whole thing. It's huge. And so for my personal work, I tend to use Flask. I've gotten really good at just spinning stuff up at Flask. I like this better than Flask-Admin. And I really want to move in the direction of using this, using FastAPI more professionally. And I've talked to some people who are startup founders who are building if they're not using something like Golang, something more performant, they're tending towards they're doubling down on the future of it, and they're building their APIs in FastAPI. And I think if you were just building a web service that didn't need all of the third-party stuff around it, FastAPI is great right now. But if you're like me and you're used to, so if you've done anything in Flask, you have all these Flask editions, the forms and, all that stuff, and you have to configure it all in your app factory. So I think this is a little bit more straightforward. You don't really need all that stuff. You can do HTTP responses. So you can build a GUI-based app in this. It's just, it's focused on APIs and focused on web services. So I don't know that I'd say that it would replace anything. I just think that it's, Flask is what it is. It's a wonderful framework. You can do, I mean, somebody told me that the Barack Obama 2012 campaign, the center of the whole campaign's data thing that we've all heard about was a Flask API, and nothing touched RDS unless it went through that. They didn't let anybody like go into the database or like pull stuff out. It was all the API. So the center of that, that campaign was Flask. So you can do a lot with Flask. I just think this, if you're into typing and you're into async and all of the more modern things that have been added to Python, I know some of that is kind of creeping into Flask, but this was built on those things.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Let's check the chat. Compared to Django with more, okay, Jacob, as usual, challenges me to go a little bit deeper. Compared to Django with more details, please. And I might need help because I've worked with Django, but most of my work is in Flask. To me, Django is like, it's a framework that has everything you might need to build something on the web, no matter what it is. You can use the REST framework to build APIs. You can build, web-based, GUI-based apps. It's a really huge framework that if I were building something like that was comparable to like an Instagram or Reddit or the things that we know of that were actually built in Django, I probably wouldn't build like a Reddit clone in Flask. So I think that this is more geared towards microservices, service-based architectures. I think that if I were building an API backend for a React project or something like that, I would reach for this unless the requirements really needed all the things that come with Django. Jacob, does that answer your question, or are you looking for something else? Okay, I got a thumbs up from Jacob. That's always good news. No more questions in the chat. Anybody else got anything?
How does this perform better than Flask in terms of the async framework? What do you kind of mess with that?
They claim that it's as fast as something built with Go and or Node.js. I haven't benchmarked it. I haven't looked into like, there was a guy I met one time that was like, he would read all of the Flask source before he would even click the whole thing before he would even talk about it. And so I'm not that guy. So I like tinkering and figuring out what I can do with things to get stuff done. Well, I think that Starlette is built to be very fast. I haven't used it directly because I've been focusing on this. Though someday I would like to. Pydantic is a really elegant framework for data validation and serialization. I believe it does more than that, but in the context of FastAPI, that's basically what you use it for. So I don't have a great answer as to why, other than it's new and modern because it's better. I mean, that's what they say, right?
Really nice if even if you're not working on the web at all, like if you're just reading and writing from like a random CSV or something like that, and you need to validate data coming out of some data stream. Pydantic is amazing for use case like that. So does type validation? Yeah, it does type validation, and it also tries to coerce, like, if you have, like, if you're reading from a CSV, everything's an integer or everything's a string. But if you have like a model with a type that's an integer, it's going to try and coerce that string to an integer for you. You don't have to do that. Yeah. And so when you actually go to use that model, there'll be an integer there instead of everything in strings. You do like converting yourself.
And in the context of FastAPI, if you do get invalid data from a request, it doesn't just blow up and say, I don't know what to do. It handles the invalid data quite elegantly, and your response back is basically a Pydantic instance, and it handles the serialization for you, whether it's a valid request or not. So it is really elegant, and it depends on whether you like code that just takes care of things for you, or if you're the kind of person who wants to like see what it's doing and dig into it. But my experience with this is I did build one professional product with it for a client. It was an MVP for a thing that was meant to ingest social media data and put it into Elasticsearch for searchability, and then endpoints to ping Elasticsearch to get the data out of it. And it worked really elegantly for that project.
Jacob was asking if it was easier to learn compared to other libraries.
I think it's a little bit more complex than Flask because it's bringing all these. It depends on how deep you've gone into Flask, but it's bringing these other new tools to the table. I would say that it's probably easier to learn broadly than Django is to learn broadly, just because Django has so much. But I've been able to be, I was a Ruby guy, and I started writing Python about 4 years ago, and pretty quickly I was able to grok the basics of FastAPI, Django, and Flask, all three, and do stuff with them. So I think FastAPI would be, if you understand everything we were just talking about and how all these pieces fit together, you could probably be productive with it pretty quickly. Django, I think you can do a lot more with just the framework itself. It just takes a long time to learn all the little bits and pieces, in my opinion. I love all three of them for the use cases that they're good for. So I'm not criticizing any of them or saying that I'm, the FastAPI superhero. It's just for somebody who really loves APIs, it's really interesting, and I like using it. Anything else? Okay, Meg.
What about if you're building an external API, like a third-party service or app to interact with? Does that change what you build on? You mentioned like the documentation, like some of the things are maybe not as robust, or as people have them.
The documentation for Starlette Admin is not as robust. The documentation for FastAPI is pretty good.
So that wouldn't matter for somebody that's trying to interact with it.
No, and actually, I'm not really, I didn't do this on this project, but one of the benefits of FastAPI that I didn't mention is that it's kind of self-documenting. So as you're writing the different URLs that somebody could consume from writing the code, they're called routes that somebody hits to, api.com/tasks. So when you're writing the code for that, there's things you can add to it that just create documentation that you can provide to clients. You can hide it behind administrative access. And the more you get into the self-documenting aspects of FastAPI, is really, really powerful. So you can be basically writing all of your docs as you're writing code, all in one task. Yeah. I'm about done. Anybody else?
Probably in the same sense that XML RPC, the Python standard library, has self-documentation as well.
I have not used that, but probably it's the same thing. It's when you're certainly if you use Flask, it uses decorators the same way. And in the decorator, you start off with the route, and then you can do like a summary and a description and all that in the parentheses of the decorator, and that becomes your documentation. So that's how it works. Okay, I think I'm done.
Thank you, Chris.
Yep, thanks.